Now we turn to an interview Thistle did with two young British radical feminists who are part of the collective Make More Noise out of Manchester. Naomi Bridges and Katy Worley spoke with Thistle via Skype last week to talk more about how they came to radical feminist activism and also about what radical feminists in the UK are up to.
All right, so this is Thistle Pedersen, and I am here with Naomi and Katy, two British feminists. Welcome to WLRN.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, so can you just tell us a little bit about yourselves and your involvement in the British feminist movement? Naomi, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So I started a feminist group at university, actually. So this was over 10 years ago, and got quite a bit of flack for it. Then sort of moved away from feminism a little bit as I kind of entered the workforce, had other feels really kind of glib just to say I had other concerns, but you do, different priorities at different times in your life. Anyway, a couple of years ago, I noticed that something was happening in the UK and something was happening with feminism in the UK. And everyone had just gone a bit insane, really. And I was aware that these reforms around what's called the Gender Recognition Act in the UK were happening. And there'd been a streak of feminism that I'd found quite disquieting, this idea that women aren't a distinct group anymore and that we had to be inclusive of everybody, including males, all the time, and it didn't really sit right with me. And I was kind of watching in horror as this stuff was unfolding, and then women, especially lesbians, were being shouted down, and then I heard about the punching of Maria McLachlan at Speaker's Corner by a trans rights activist, and I was just horrified by the whole thing, and started to try and find people that thought the same way as me, or that were shared the same concerns that I did. Started going to different meetings of different groups, and then I met Katy, and we thought we should try and do something together.
Yeah, and so then that was the birth of Make More Noise. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think we got together, we wanted to do something, and we thought there's no like UK blog, radical feminist blog, or a magazine that we wanted to see, something that actually spoke in a bit more of a basic language to people. I think there's a lot of great blogs out there, and they are fantastic, but I think a lot of them use quite convoluted language, and that they weave around with all this special terminology, and we just felt like if you're a working class woman or person, then you're not really going to be able to take part in the debate. So we were trying to make something that was a little bit more direct, because we didn't really see that there was that organisation out there. And then it just sort of one thing after another. So we did the blog, and then we started the podcast. And then last year, was it 2019, around April, May, we just said, should we do an event? And then that kicked off. We've done about 4 or 5 events. And I think one thing that's been really interesting in the UK is a lot of the activism is centered around these events that women have put on. And as much the events themselves and the speeches and the talks and the fact that women network, a lot of the pushback and a lot of publicity has been generated by these events. And thinking of, they've had bomb threats, they've been protested, and it's really been it's almost like a tactic that's used now in the women's movement to shine a light on some of the behaviour of trans rights activists.
I agree. I had never heard of just holding a talk, like at a public library, or I don't know, a speaking event. That started, I think, this time around with our 4th wave, 5th wave feminism, whatever you want to call this wave, this current upsurge in activism in the UK. And so you should be really proud of that. It's a wonderful tactic. And that was Katy speaking, right? Katy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with feminism?
Well, to be honest, I've not got a background in politics. Before this kicked off, I was a DJ, so I've got a bit of a background in events. I was always quite politically engaged, but more like shout at the telly politics rather than go to a rally politics. But when I found out all about all these changes and I started reading about things, I think one thing that shocked me was the fact that all these organisations like the Fawcett Society and Women's Aid and all these organisations that were set up to protect women's rights we're basically turning a blind eye, if not actively encouraging the erosion of our rights. And it just felt like, I kept waiting for somebody to do something. And more my heroes kept saying ridiculous things, and losing a lot of respect for people. And it just eventually you just realise, no one's going to get you out of this mess. You can't just sit back and wait for the Labour Party to take an interest. You can't sit back and wait for the Human Rights Commission to take an interest. If you want to fight something, then you just got to start doing it yourself. And I think that's one of the good things about the UK movement as it is. There's a lot of people who've never done anything like this before, who just thought, you know what, I've got to use whatever skills I've got to do something,
I think that's something that we are lucky to have in the UK, because we're such a small country, and so we have the advantage of actually being able to get to other events and stuff quite easily. Whether if you're in the north, there'll be events going on in northern cities. If you're in the south, there'll be events going on in London. If you're in Scotland, there are events going on in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I think we have that advantage of being able to travel, because we're all a lot closer to each other over here than you guys are over there.
Yeah, it's been fantastic to see how organized you are and how quickly you were able to come together and really broadcast out to the world that, hey, we're the UK feminists, we're here, and we're not going away. Yeah. And it's definitely had a ripple effect in other parts of the world, including my country, the US. So it's wonderful to be part of an international movement and to inspire one another. Speaking of the Labour Party in the UK, I'm interested to know how things have gone in the last 3 to 4 years. I remember reading that there was a massive walkout of hundreds of women from the UK Labour Party a couple years ago. Can you just walk me and our listeners through the past 3 or 4 years in the Labour Party with regards to women?
Yeah, well, I was one of the women who left at the time. It was the hashtag, I think, was Labour losing women, and all of that started around because they made a decision to allow men to basically self-identify on all women shortlists. Now these were because they wanted to engage more women in politics. For many years, Labour had an all women shortlist, so when they had seats go up, it had to go to a woman. And there was a lot of controversy with that within the party itself, but when they allowed men to self-identify onto those lists, it was basically just a smack in the mouth for Labour women, who suddenly realised that the Labour men didn't really understand the first thing about sexism. And there was a young women's officer called Lily Madigan, who actually had a fair part to play in my own peak transing. Because, just to see a schoolboy basically being given this role as if it was, what is womanhood? This boy can represent you as well as he's been a woman for 2 minutes. Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of groups like Women's Place UK, they've been so successful because they're capitalising on the anger basically of women and lifelong trade unionists and socialists who are being told that they're now hateful bigots, and basically all of the work that they've ever done, not just for women, for other social justice causes, is just chucked out the window. And the abuse that you receive from so-called comrades is quite shocking and scary for a lot of women, and it's made them realise. I mean, a lot of it, what the radical lesbian separatists were saying in the 1980s, this is like an old fight between the socialist feminists and the radical feminists, is, that these men on the left still treat women like shit, basically, and don't understand that they oppress women in the same way that capitalists.
Can you talk about your prime minister? I know it was Theresa May. Was she in the Labour Party, and is your current prime minister in the Labour Party? And what's the difference between the two of them regarding the Gender Recognition Act and all of this?
So Theresa May is a Conservative Prime Minister, and so is our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So we've not actually had a Labour government since 2010. And very broadly speaking, we have the Conservative a right-wing party and the Labour are a left-wing party. But it was the Equalities Minister, Katy Maria? Is it Maria Miller, or did I make that up? No, it's Maria Miller.
Maria Miller, yeah.
And she proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, and I think that the Tories probably did this as
Sorry, when you say Tories, do you mean the Conservative Party?
Yes, yeah, it's a
Okay,
nickname
thank
for the
you.
Conservative Party, yeah. And the Conservative Party did this, I think, as just a gesture so they could be seen to be doing something progressive, and that it didn't really cost them much, and they just didn't think about it. They thought it would just be an easy thing that they could do that would make them look good. And then and they just hadn't thought about it really. So it was actually, these gender recognition reforms were tabled by the Conservatives, not by Labour, but Labour fully supported them. And yeah, as Katy mentioned, they'd been doing all this other self-ID stuff within the party, where men can just self-identify as women without any of the formal legal obligations that you have to fulfill, like getting a gender recognition certificate that shows that you can be a different sex under law.
I think another thing was a lot of the men who identified as women ended up saying disgusting things about women. Suck my balls, and behaving like very much entitled misogynistic men, and not only men who actually seem to actively hate women. And this is something that's now the Tories are shelving the plans. They've decided to basically kick it into the long grass. But the Labour Party has again, it just seems to be like in a purity spiral. It signed a pledge that's demanding to expel from the party everybody who's a member of Women's Place UK or the LGB Alliance. These are a couple of groups again who formed to campaign against gender recognition and self-ID reforms. So it feels in a strange position where the Conservatives seem to have more care for women's rights than the Labour Party, and people on the left are the ones who are sort of actively encouraging this climate of terror against women and feminists.
But Theresa May was very much in favor of the reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, right? But now it's tabled under Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, she was in favor as much as any political leader is just in favor of something that they think will make them look good. I honestly don't think she'd ever thought about it. I think she was just in favor of it because it was something that they felt that they could do that wouldn't really mean anything or do anything and would make them look good.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the reason why the plans have been shelved is because of how effective the campaign was. Fair Play for Women is a campaign group who managed to mobilise lots of, basically a leafleting campaign. Women would go out into every Friday and Saturday in the town centres and just tell people about the plans, because most people have no idea, and when you tell them about it, they're shocked. So I think a lot of that is actually due to the fact of the mobilisation from women, and it's made the Tory party stop and look at it and think, this is probably not going to be the vote winner that we thought it was. But again, I think
yes, but are they actual allies to women? I mean, it's one thing
No.
to table it
No.
and table it and say we're not interested in pursuing this any further, but it's another thing to actually be an ally to women. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think they've tabled it not out of, as you rightly point out, not out of an obligation of doing the right thing for women. They've tabled it because they've realised it's going to be more trouble than it's worth, because we have mounted quite a successful campaign against it. But yeah, I completely agree there. They're not allies to women. I don't think women truly have allies on the right or the left at the moment. And the Conservatives definitely push through a lot of legislation that isn't very kind to women at all. So I think it's right to point out that even though they've tabled these reforms that were damaging to women, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Conservatives are on the side of women.
I think that a lot of it is they've seen that it's a wedge issue in the left, and they're exploiting it. They're canny politicians, and they've seen what it does in leftist circles everywhere, where trans right activism seems to, even in small groups, like in Facebook groups about, being a chess group, and suddenly...
Yeah, a reading club, yeah.
But I mean, like I say, I don't think the Tories are any friends to women. They instituted an austerity programme which cuts back to social welfare, and 86% of those cuts were directed at women. So women have lost a lot of support from since I think the Tories got in 2010. So a lot has been taken, and I think that it is good to remember. I mean, you're in a rock and a hard place, basically.
Yeah, so is there any talk in the UK of starting a British women's party or a third party that would be for women and only women and by women?
Now that's interesting because we do have a party in the UK called the Women's Equality Party, and they started a few years ago, and they basically the feminists all over were waiting with bated breath to see what the Women's Equality Party were going to say about the Gender Recognition Act reforms and about self-identification more generally. And loads of feminists were deeply, deeply disappointed by the Women's Equality Party response. Because they just got very mealy-mouthed about the whole thing. And then, who was the leader at the time? Was it Sophie Walker?
Sophie Walker, yes.
Yeah, and she did go to a Women's Place meeting, didn't she? And she made notes. But then, God, what did they come out with that statement? They said, God, it was something. They came out with a statement basically not saying like here or there what they were going to do or what they believed. And
trying to sit on the fence and both sides
are they still sitting on the fence?
I don't know. No, but no one really pays attention.
Nobody talks about it. Okay.
I mean,
it's just, do they even exist anymore? I mean, you said they started back in 2010.
They do, but I think people spent a lot of time trying to convince them that they needed to change their policies, and they haven't managed to as yet. I don't know. Are you following them? What are Women's Place UK up to, Naomi?
Do you mean Women's Equality Party?
Oh, there you go. I can't remember the name. Yeah, Women's Equality Party.
That I actually don't know because I've not followed them because they've just been so mealy-mouthed about everything, and that I think, and I don't think they're big enough or strong enough to really be a party for women as well. I think if women want to really enact change, I don't know what the answer is, but I think probably going to have to work with the tools that we have, i.e. working with the bigger parties and trying to get them to understand, because I think, it's going to be a long time before we see any sort of majority government of leftists.
Well, I think that there's some interesting moves. There's the Women's Labour Declaration was launched, and there's a similar one from the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, and the Conservatives. So women within those parties are trying to work together to sort of put forward this platform and to show that this is an issue which doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. We all have concerns, and we're united by our by the fact that we're females, and our sex-based rights are under threat. So I think there might be some interesting movements in the next year or so, but I don't think there's any plans to split off and form a new sort of radical or,
that thing that is that Katy speaking?
Yes.
That thing that you were just talking about, that what we call is bipartisan, women from different parties forming a group. What is that exactly? What are they calling themselves?
I think they've got a name as yet. They've all basically asked the party to sign up to like a women's declaration, which is a set of beliefs which basically asking people to recognise that our rights are sort of sex-based and make pledges to uphold sex-based rights, extend them, and basically just listen and hear our concerns, because that's the thing that debate's been shut down and we're not able to have a discussion. But again, I think it's really difficult in the UK because the parliamentary system, it's the first past the post, so there's very little collaboration between the political parties. It's just the winner takes it all and everybody else just gets in line. So you almost have like a dictatorship where whichever party's in power gets to make all the decisions. I know the situation's a little bit different in Scotland, and they've managed to be a bit more successful in lobbying for change. They've actually seemed to got through to some Scottish Nationalist Party politicians, Scottish Nationalists, the SNP, Scottish Nationalist Party are in power in Scotland at the moment, and that is a broad-based coalition. It's got Conservative members and Liberal and Socialist members, so they're sort of used to dealing with things in that way, and I think they've been a bit more successful in lobbying for change and for to get an ear to the government.
Okay. So what else would you like to tell our listeners about your work in the UK? What are some goals that you have as radical and lesbian feminists for the future? And then obviously that brings up the time that I'm doing this interview with you is the time of the virus, and how you think that is going to be impacting how feminists in the UK organize and function.
I think with so much of the organising being done on events, I think a lot of us, we haven't got any events in the pipeline, fortunately. We were about to book some venues up, so it's good for us to not, you know, we haven't lost any of the money, but there'll be a lot of events are on hold, a lot of activism is on hold.
Yeah.
So I think a lot, you know, it's like everything's in stasis at the moment, and we don't even know when we finish quarantine. I mean, I can't really see the Gender Recognition Act being passed now. I think that we're in a totally different world, and I don't know what our priorities will be at the end of it all, you know?
Yeah. We're hunkering down over here too. But a lot of women are online, Zoom meeting with one another. You know, I was in a Zoom meeting that had like 20 women in it, just checking in with each other, seeing how we're doing, that kind of thing. And there's also a lot online events that are happening. Wolf initiated an online event. It was supposed to be an in real life event, but now because of the virus, they've created an Eventbrite, so you can buy your ticket. There's going to be lawyers talking, and these 3 high school girls from Connecticut talking about their sports team and how these 2 boys are winning scholarships and actual meets, track meets, that these girls feel that they could have won or been eligible for if these boys hadn't been on their team. And that's hosted by Wolf and Save Women's Sports, and that's going to be on April 2nd. So the same day that we air this podcast. But you know, it's just not the same as meeting in person, is it? I mean, I'm excited to go to this event online, and I'm even going to try to cover it for WLRN, which is kind of a concept to wrap your head around. But maybe that's what we need to be doing for now, just hoping that we can meet together in person in the future.
Yeah, I agree that keeping up the connections is so important. But yeah, it doesn't replace meeting people in real life. That all the events that we've talked about that have been happening in the UK, they're really, really great, and it's so wonderful to hear so many speakers and, you know, people who really know their stuff and are excellent speakers. But the most valuable part of it is probably when we all go to the pub after and we network and we meet other like-minded women. And that's how Katy and I started our thing, because we both went to an event that Posie Parker put on. And then there were a group of us in Manchester, who got on in a WhatsApp group afterwards, who were in Manchester, because we were all hanging out at the pub and chatting after that event. And it's the real life connections that women can make between women that are just so valuable. And yeah, I worry that because we don't have that because of the virus, and we need to keep it up and, you know, keep those connections going until we can meet again.
Yeah, I mean, my other concern is just with feminist activism, and, you know, like, I think one of the impacts of the virus and women being in homes is, you know, domestic abuse rates are going to skyrocket, and the damage to the social fabric that all this is having. You know, I think one thing is we're seeing the value of female labour. A lot of people on the front line will be nurses, cleaners, shop assistants, and it's female labour at home, women looking after children. And, you know, although I'm not saying that, you know, men don't help out, the majority of domestic labour falls on women. And, you know, like I say, there's when all this finishes, I think a lot of our energies will be put in maybe other places. We'll have other things that we need to concern ourselves with, which is shit, because, you know, we you know, there's just more and more battles that seem to be, you know, fires breaking out left, right and centre.
Thank you so much, Katy and Naomi, for being on WLRN with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and share ideas.
Yeah, nice to speak to some sisters across the pond and have a listen to what's going on over there with you guys.
You are listening to WLRN.